Ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to begin a question period, and the speakers will be asked to speak briefly in reply to questions which some of you submitted during the intermission. It's unfortunate that all the questions submitted could not be used, but unless this is to go on till 3 o'clock in the morning, a selection had to be made, and a selection has been made of 4 questions for Dr. Morris and 4 for Dr. Miller. The first one, which I'll read out, is addressed to Dr. Morris. If we are to accept that the Creator spoke the universe into existence with photons, conveniently placed so as to make stars look billions of light years away, could we not equally accept that the universe was created a millisecond ago with prepackaged memories of your 2.5-hour debate implanted in our minds? If the Creator can do anything, can't we accept anything?
This device of trying to defeat an argument by ridicule rather than by serious consideration, of course, has been used many times in the past. And obviously, when you suggest the Creator could create things with an appearance of built-in memories, yes, in principle, of course, as the Creator, he could do that. And if there is a Creator, then you can't say no. But on the other hand, that would raise a question of purpose and deception. But when we suggest that there is creation, then the only way to say that there is no possibility of creation with an appearance of maturity or completeness or appearance of age or whatever is to say that creation is impossible. And that's to say that there's no Creator, which is tantamount to atheism. You finally have to take your choice. It is reasonable that the Creator, if the Creator exists, would create things fully functioning right from the beginning. Now, I did mention that there are other possibilities with respect to the matter of the light and the apparent creation of the light energy along with the generators of the light energy. There's the possibility of Riemannian space, which Dr. Moon and Dr. Spencer have elaborated in considerable detail. Dr. Schlusser then has picked it up in his book, The Age of the Cosmos, and has shown that it is possible, if you use a different form of space geometry than Einsteinian geometry, that even though you use Euclidean space, light will travel in Riemannian space, and it works out, the mathematical equations work out, that light would reach the Earth from an infinite distance in 15.7 years. Now, I don't understand that, but these astrophysicists at MIT worked it out, and that's what their equations give. There's also the possibility that the Creator created the universe fully functioning. And from the point of view of a creationist, if you want to ridicule that belief, all right, I see nothing ridiculous about it.
On to the suggestion about Riemannian space. I have learned a little bit about Riemannian geometry in a course. I've got a D to show for it. And essentially, what it involves is that there is a theoretical way to organize space called Riemannian geometry, in which the light from a distant star, if you set up this particular kind of theoretical geometry, could be here in 15 light years. The next question is Riemannian space used to describe the universe? The answer is no. It's strictly an imaginary system. There's some very interesting papers about it. It's not used because it doesn't conform to the observed universe. Dr. Morris is attempting, as he often does, when he's short on the facts, to sow a little confusion, to say, well, maybe the light got here in 15 years and so forth. Doesn't cut it. It's not true. Theoretical description. And the scientists who wrote the papers he quotes say, this is in a universe we imagine. It doesn't correspond to the real one.
Question for Dr. Miller. How do you explain the footprints in stone phenomenon? In Texas, single strata of rock were found to contain 23 footprints in line that were crossing lines of Brontosaurus tracks. This contradicts the geological timetable. The tracks are thought to be separated from each other by 60 to 70 million years or so.
Carousel number 2, slide 10. Could you cut the big lights in front? I think we can leave the overhead ones on. Maybe not, though. Is it up there? It's just too bright? There we go. Okay, I wasn't sure Dr. Morris would bring a slide, so I brought my own. There they are. If we turn this one light off, we'd actually be able to see it. Those are the contemporaneous footprints of man and dinosaurs. That's great. Now, here's how I explain it in all honesty, and I'm not trying to be a wise guy. I believe, quite simply, that the people who present these as evidence have learned a lesson from a hoax perpetrated in the human anthropological literature known as Piltdown Man. Piltdown Man was a fossil that somebody planted and some poor other sucker dug up and put in the human evolutionary sequence and named and so forth and so on. And when those nasty people with radiometric dating came along in the 1950s, they made them drag the skull and the jaw out of the museum and they dated them. And what they discovered was that the jaw dated to the present time, and the skull was 15 or 20,000 years old. The reason for that is because the skull was the skull of a Homo sapiens sapiens, and the jaw was the jaw of a chimpanzee, and they'd been set up as a hoax. What the footprints show is that the special creationists have learned a lesson from Piltdown Man, and the lesson is, if you bring in a bone, they'll date it. Give them a footprint. One other point I want to make. For some reason, the only footprints that show up here are humans. Now, if the special creationists are right, we ought to have few dog tracks, few cat tracks, few deer tracks. For some reason, only humans. And the answer is a carving of a human footprint would have the greatest psychological effect. I believe I did. The question is, how do you... Excuse me. I believe I did. The question was, how do you explain them? I say they're fakes.
The footprints were not a hoax. They're there. I've seen them. You can put your foot in them. Some of them are giant-sized tracks. Some of them are baby-sized tracks. Some of them are normal-sized tracks. They'll fit your foot just as good as a house shoe. These were not carvings. I mentioned that before. There was a trail leading under the riverbank, so a bulldozer was brought in to turn out the overlying strata under the bank to see if the trails were still there. And sure enough, they were. And this was thoroughly explored and documented. Now, we don't know for sure who made the tracks because we didn't see them made. It might have been a two-legged dinosaur with feet like human feet, as the one man said. But they were feet like human feet, and there are real tracks. This is documented quite a bit more in a recent book that we have just published called Tracking Those Incredible Dinosaurs and the People Who Knew Them. And there are about 200 photographs in the book. It's written from a geological point of view. My son is the author. He's PhD in geological engineering. He's on the faculty at the University of Oklahoma in this field, and he spent many, many weeks down there measuring and documenting all of this information. It does look like there is good evidence, not only in terms of the footprints, but the pictographs, stories of dragons and so forth, that man and the dinosaur did live at the same time.
A second question for Dr. Morris. How do you reconcile the reproduction of multicellular organisms from zygote to adult, or the development of a seed into a plant, with the second law of thermodynamics? Development of any living creature into an adult organism implies an increase in order and therefore a decrease in entropy.
Okay, that's a good question. I'm sorry I didn't have time to get into it before, and I'm not sure I really have adequate time now. No creationist that I know of has ever said that it's impossible to have an increase in order in an open system. We insist that you can have an increase in order in an open system. We also point out that the second law of thermodynamics, which is a very broad principle, doesn't apply strictly to heat flow equations or to chemical process rate equations. It's a universal principle, as the references given earlier indicate. The second law of thermodynamics says that in any system there is a tendency for that system to go from order to disorder, or from complexity to simplicity. And everybody knows that. Everybody experiences that. You just let things go, they go down. They wear out, they disintegrate, they die finally. This is universal experience. There's a tendency in even open systems for this to happen. But in an open system, open to external energy, you can, under certain conditions, neutralize that decay effect or even reverse it and have an increase of order. And a classic example would be the growth of a seed into a plant, or a zygote into a fully developed animal, or a pile of bricks into a building. You can have an increase of order in an open system, obviously. Now, just to say that you can have it doesn't mean that you usually have it. Matter of fact, every system is an open system. A closed system only exists in the ideal world of a blackboard where you can draw a circle. In the real world, every system is an open system. And furthermore, every system is open to the energy of the sun, either directly or indirectly, as far as the Earth is concerned. All systems get their energy ultimately from the sun. That means that to say that a system is open to the energy of the sun is to say nothing that isn't true of everything. So that's meaningless as far as a particular reply to this problem is concerned. And when we say that there's a conflict between the second law of thermodynamics and evolution, for evolutionists to say, well, the second law of thermodynamics only applies to closed systems and the Earth is an open system, open to the energy of the sun, is really not a meaningful statement, because that statement applies to every system, and most systems decrease in order. Now, the point is, what do you have in a system like a seed going into a plant or a pile of bricks going into a building? What do you have in those kinds of systems that reverse that trend, that take the raw energy which comes in and converts it into the useful work of building up the complex structure? Now, in every kind of a system where we do have an increase of order that we know anything about, if you analyze these closely, you'll find that always at least two other criteria have to be satisfied. To have an open system open to external energy is a necessary condition, but it isn't a sufficient condition. Now, in addition, you have to have a code or a program or a template or something to organize the growth, to direct the growth, like the blueprint for the building or like the genetic code for the seed. Some kind of a highly complex information program already built into the system or accessible to it to direct its growth. Otherwise, if it grows at all, it'll just be a heterogeneous blob. It won't increase in order a bit. And in addition to that, you have to have some kind of a conversion mechanism, a motor, membrane, or something else to store the raw energy from the sun, which would otherwise disintegrate and break things down, and then convert it into the very specific forms of work needed to build up the complex structure. In the case of the seed, you have the marvelous mechanism of photosynthesis, which converts the sun's energy through a complex series of processes into the useful work of building up the plant tissue. In the case of the building, you have the machinery, the muscles of the workmen, and so forth that take the sun's energy and convert it through all sorts of intermediate processes before it becomes the useful work. You see, if all you have is just raw heat energy flowing into a system, into an open system, you will not increase the order of that system at all. If you go back to your equations of thermodynamics, you know that if you have an influx of heat energy into an open system, not a closed system, but into an open system, an influx of heat energy into an open system will increase the entropy of that system more rapidly than if it were a closed system. It will break it up. It won't increase the order at all. In other words, you've got to have a mechanism to direct the growth and a conversion system, a code, I should say, to direct the growth, and a conversion mechanism to energize the growth, or you won't get any growth no matter how much energy comes into the open system from the sun. Now, the question is, what does evolution have in terms of a biochemical predestinating code directing the growth of primeval chemicals into complex people over the ages? It is a continuum in a space-time frame from some simple systems back in the beginning to a very complex biosphere now. Nobody knows what that is. And what is the mechanism that converts the sun's energy into this complex work of building up the complex biosphere, converting, say, a population of worms into a population of crocodiles or something over the ages? Now, there is no answer to that yet. There have been certain people who have tried to pose answers. Dr. Miller quoted Dr. Eigen. Dr. Prigogine got a Nobel Prize for trying to get at a part of the answer. But nobody really has the answer yet. We're nowhere near explaining how evolution and entropy can really coexist on any significant scale. Now, even if such an answer is ever given, finally, if somebody can pose a code and a mechanism to explain how evolution can take place in spite of the second law of thermodynamics, it still will not be as good as the creation model. The creation model does not have to explain the second law of thermodynamics. The creation model predicts the second law of thermodynamics. It's exactly what you'd expect in the creation model.
At some point or another, you have to consider what's true. Dr. Morris said, if all you have, and Dr. Morris is a very good debater. He chooses his words carefully. He really does. He says, for example, if all you have is an influx of heat energy, underlying heat, into a system, the system will increase in disorder. That's true. If you take some molecules of water and you heat them up, the hot water is more disordered than cold water. That's true. That's a principle of thermodynamics. He chose his words carefully. He said heat. He didn't say, for example, ultraviolet radiation. Ultraviolet radiation has all sorts of bad effects on you when you're already organized. That's why we'd like to have the ozone layer up there, because we're already organized and so forth. But if you take a system like the one in Stanley Miller's flask and you shine ultraviolet light on that, what happens? One of the things that happens is that hydrogen cyanide suddenly forms adenine. Adenine is more ordered than hydrogen cyanide was. That's not supposed to happen. You're supposed to have a program. You need a blueprint. You need a code. It's false. It happens. There's something interesting about Stanley Miller's experiments. When they first did them, they had this spark. Everything ran. And the creationists said, why did you use a spark? There probably wasn't any lightning on the primitive Earth. Well, there might have been. But the reason Stanley Miller used a spark was because first he set up his apparatus and he took an ultraviolet light and he shined it on the flask and he put a special quartz window on it because UV light doesn't pass through glass well to allow the radiation to come inside. He had to abandon the approach. The reason he had to abandon it is because these simple, disordered, unstructured molecules, when the ultraviolet light hit them, organized into complex, intricate, organized structures so quickly they gummed up the window in the flask. At some point, you have to consider what's true. You put energy of a certain kind into a system, you will get an increase in order. You'll get it without a program.
Second question for Dr. Miller. How could the universe, as a closed system with no energy available but what it originated with out of the Big Bang, evolve from a disordered state to an ordered state?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. The question contains a self-contradiction. No serious scientist who studies the Big Bang cosmology insists for a moment that the universe was more ordered 15 billion years ago that the universe was disordered and then suddenly became orderly. Our solar system did not suddenly come from a random mixture of hydrogen, helium, and condense into order. That's not true. Big Bang cosmology says precisely the opposite. The Big Bang says that the most ordered state that ever existed was that Big Bang. Now, there's a marvelous book by a Nobel laureate at Harvard named Stanley Weinberg called The First 3 Minutes, trying to postulate what could have happened. And the fact of the matter is that nobody says what the question implies. The universe is running downhill. It's running downhill now. And the only reason that we see an increase in order, which is life on this planet, is because the universe is going downhill at a tremendous rate. And we see that process of going downhill every morning when the sun comes up, because that loss of energy from the sun is what drives things here. The universe as a whole is going downhill. We didn't get ordered out of disorderliness. The universe was the most ordered at the point of the Big Bang. That's precisely the point of Big Bang cosmology. The question doesn't understand.
I'm afraid there's a great deal of misunderstanding about the reversal of entropy that would be necessary in the first few minutes of the Big Bang to produce this order from which it's been running down. Let me just indicate this by one quote from Dr. Paul Davies of the King's College in London, a prominent British astronomer. The title is Universe in Reverse, Can Time Run Backwards? He says there's good evidence that the primeval universe was not ordered but highly chaotic. A relic of the primordial chaos survives in the curious radiation from space believed to be the last fading remnant of the primeval heat. And the characteristics of its spectrum reveal that in the earliest moments of the universe, the cosmological material was completely unstructured. Now, he says, to discover the cosmic winding mechanism, one has to investigate the processes that occurred between about 1 second and 10 minutes after the bang. Unfortunately, the expansion is now too sluggish to have much invigorating effect, so the universe seems doomed to steadily unwind again until all organized activity ceases, and so on. Now, here's his conclusion. So far, it has been supposed that the shuffling process is random. But how do we know that the universe which emerged from the Big Bang was truly chaotic, so that subsequent collisions between atoms and interactions between subatomic particles are overwhelmingly likely to disintegrate any order which may appear? If the miracle of the Big Bang, and note he uses the word miracle, you have to go against the second law of thermodynamics to do it, included miraculously organized subatomic arrangements too, then random shuffling would have to be replaced by organized rearrangement. And so you have to postulate an exception to the second law of thermodynamics to make the Big Bang function in the first few minutes.
Two questions remain for each speaker. I've been asked by the arrangements chairman to use the gavel to keep the answers and rebuttals brief. Third question addressed to Dr. Morris. You ask why we only see gaps between species and never see species in the process of splitting up. Scientists observe many examples of species that look as if they were in the process of splitting up. For example, species of birds look identical but cannot crossbreed. Other groups of birds are able to crossbreed, but only with difficulty, at a very low success rate. Similarly, a horse and a donkey can crossbreed to create a mule, but the mule is sterile and cannot crossbreed further. Aren't these examples of the species giving rise to another species?
I'm not quite sure I understand the point of the question, but let me repeat what I said earlier, that we creationists, do not know the precise limits of variation within the created kind. We do not know whether the created kind corresponds to a modern species, as it does perhaps in many cases, or to the genus, as it does perhaps in many cases, or even to the family, as it may do in some cases. I think this is room for further creationist research, and a number of creationist geneticists are working on this at the biomolecular level to try to delineate this a little better. We would suggest that if species do produce fertile hybrids, this is probably a good indication that they represent original kinds that have become separated and more or less reproductively isolated for a while. If they produce sterile hybrids, I think the question needs further study. We do not profess to have a full answer, as I said, to what exactly constitutes the created kind. Neither, of course, does the evolutionist know exactly what a species is, because there have traditionally been the lumpers and the splitters, and these are taxonomic categories that have been made ever since the days of Linnaeus for man's convenience, and they're somewhat arbitrary. They're subject to change with further research.
Dr. Miller chooses not to comment on that reply. We'll instead take the third question addressed to him. Dr. Miller stated that he could possibly enter the universe, a closed system, from surroundings. Now, the existence of surroundings is purely presuppositional in nature. That is, it is not based on empiricism or rationalism. The existence of surroundings is clearly beyond the scope of finite man. Presuppositions are all right as long as you don't use them as a base for other assumptions. Dr. Miller, please support the concept of a surrounding system for the universe.
I'm not aware I ever said anything like that. I believe what I said is that the Earth has surroundings and energy can enter the Earth. I have no support for such a concept. I don't believe I ever said anything, and I'm not sure that anyone actually does. Now, there is an interesting thing that I think this question is trying to bring up, and I think this person is perhaps trying to force me into saying that the thermodynamics, because the universe has been running down, implies that there was something to wind it up in the first place, and therefore it implies that there was a creation, because the creator had to provide the energy in the system, had to provide the high degree of order that existed at the creation of the universe. Well, the difficulties that science has with that are very great. My own personal reaction to it is very simple. I agree. I think that is evidence for creation. I think that's one of the reasons for believing that there is a creator. The question is not between Dr. Morris and me whether or not there's a creator. I think the universe was created. I think that's why we're here. I subscribe to the point of view, not as a scientist, but as a person trying to make sense out of the world I see around me in a theological way. I subscribe to the point that Hans Kung makes in Arguments Against the Atheist. And one of those points is, if there is no God, why is there something instead of nothing? So I believe I agree with the questioner. Thanks.
Dr. Miller wishes to take his fourth and final question at once. Dr. Morris, you mentioned that the Earth's strata were formed by a catastrophic flood, and that creatures we now see as highly evolved ran from the flood to higher levels. Highly evolved plants are found only in higher geologic strata. In lower geologic levels, you see only lower plants. Could you please explain how these highly evolved plants ran from the flood catastrophe?
The question, although it's cast in a sort of sarcastic name, does have a point, and there's the point. We're going to say this last question, and I think you can see, and from the responses and reactions and rebuttals and so forth, that there's much to be said on both sides. Dr. Miller probably doesn't agree with my answers. I certainly don't agree with his. The arguments and discussions could go on for a long time. He sort of refuted or attempted to refute Dr. Barnes' magnetic field decay problem. Of course, I realized when I put those dates on the screen that he had asked me to do that, and therefore he was sort of laying for me, but that was all right. But don't think that Dr. Barnes hasn't anticipated this question of the reversal of the magnetic field. He has. This is discussed at great length and answered it, I think, with overwhelming cogency. And the problem still does exist. The evidence for the magnetic field decay does still stand. Now, with respect to the origin of the strata in the flood, I did not suggest that animals ran from lower levels to higher levels. I said that the basic order that one would predict in a worldwide hydraulic cataclysm would be in order of ecological zonation. That is, those animals that live at the lower elevations would, other things being equal, tend to be buried at the lowest elevations. That is, the simple marine organisms which live at the depths of the ocean would tend to be buried at the bottom. The less mobile marine invertebrates would tend to be buried fairly low. The free-swimming marine vertebrates, fishes and so on, would tend to be buried higher. They live at higher elevations and also would be able to escape burial more for a greater length of time. Then the animals that live at the interface between the land and the water, the amphibians, then the reptiles, and the animals that live at the upper levels, the mammals, and the higher levels, birds and man. That's a general order of ecological zonation, or elevation of habitat, if you will. And that is that you find in each local geological column. Within a formation, the sorting action of moving water is very, very efficient. This can be shown both in the laboratory and by mathematics. And so within a formation, the order tends to be from the more simple, less differentiated on the bottom to the more complex, differentiated, more mobile, and also less streamlined near the top of the formation. The order of mobility has a little bearing, but the major factor delineating the differences, I would say, is one of ecological zonation. And there we find exactly what we would generally expect to find in a worldwide flood.
Could you put on the second carousel? Sorry about this. Slide 11. Dr. Morris makes the point that what we see in the ground could be the result of ecological zonation. That occurred to the geologists of 200 years ago, and it was rejected 200 years ago. There's a very simple reason why. Can I have slide 11? Here are three organisms, or here will be three organisms, which clearly share common ecological zones. They swim in the ocean. They're about the same size. They're all vertebrates. They're all excellent swimmers. Where they exist, the two that are around today, they certainly exist side by side. We have ichthyosaur, a kind of ichthyosaur, a reptile that had gone back into the sea. In the middle we have a shark. In the bottom we have a porpoise. Now, the shark appears first, actually, because we see this sort of animal before we see any reptiles, then the ichthyosaur, then the porpoise. They share identical ecological zones. We don't see them in the same place in the stratum. We see them hundreds of millions of years apart. The idea of ecological zonation is not true, it's discredited, it's wrong.
The final question for Dr. Miller. Evolution states that life began through the formation of amino acids from a soup of chemicals. How then, in your opinion, did mere chemicals, which even man may be reduced to, acquire the property known as life? Furthermore, you spoke of a self-replicating molecular RNA. But does that mean that life exists? And if so, what is death?
I like the question. I used to teach at another university north of here, which will remain unnamed and is a member of our athletic conference. And And one of my colleagues there was a gentleman named George Wald, who's a very, very famous biochemist and won the Nobel Prize for the physiology of vision. And I respond to the last three words in the question, what is death? And George Wald had a famous lecture. He was a very famous man, Nobel laureate, still is a famous man, still around, I shouldn't say it. He's a Nobel laureate, but he insisted on charging in and teaching the large introductory biology course every year. And the highlight of George's lectures, and it would draw 1,000 people, there were only 500 in the class, so 1,000 would come charging in. It's his final lecture, and the lecture was called Sex is Death. And my answer to the question is sex is death, and death is sex. And the reason for that, this doesn't have anything to do with evolutionary debate, is that if you divide into a copy of yourselves, the way a bacterium does, you're immortal, because in a sense you can't tell which one you are if you keep splitting. So the identity of an individual becomes merged in that kind of distinction. But when an organism develops a sexual mechanism, the sexual mechanism makes the parent distinct from the offspring. And therefore, the parent has a finite lifetime, the parent dies. And that is the reason why sex implies the death of the individual. So death is sex. The next part of the question was, how did life evolve from these simple organisms, and I believe something to the effect is self-replicating RNA alive? Well, that's a semantic question in terms of what is a virus alive? Is E. coli alive? Is self-replicating RNA alive? If I take a DNA molecule which we can derive from a certain source and put it in a test tube, throw the right stuff in, it'll make a virus. The virus can then infect a cell, and it kind of lives when it's in the cell, and so forth and so on. There are semantic problems in this. You tell me what you mean by life, and I'll tell you whether or not it's alive. Now, I may have my own definitions, and the fact of the matter is that a self-replicating molecule does not fit my own definitions. How did life evolve? Nobody knows how life evolved. That's absolutely true. But the question is, can we say with certainty that life could not have evolved from non-living chemicals? And the answer is, as far as we can tell from trying to test things in the laboratory and seeing if there's an insurmountable barrier, is, as far as we can tell, no. Now, you should be aware of something, though, and that is that there is a very, very serious subgroup in science who says they don't believe that life evolved on Earth, and perhaps life originated somewhere else and got here on a meteorite or a spaceship or something like that. And many very serious scientists believe that. Now, there are ways to poke fun at that suggestion. The fact of the matter is it would be entirely consistent with what we do observe in the fossil record, and there's really no way to decide it. But the question that really matters to science is, can we exclude the possibility that it could have evolved? And the answer to that question very simply is no. I think this may be my last opportunity to speak. I want to thank Dr. Morris immensely for this evening. It's a great honor to have shared the stage with him. I have enjoyed it, and I've profited by the experience, and I hope all of us have left here with a clearer understanding of what these two models mean and what they correspond to in the basis of fact. Thanks.
I don't think I need to respond any further to the particular question, but I also wanted the opportunity to thank Dr. Miller. I've been in a number of these debates, not nearly as many as my colleague, Dr. Gish, but enough of them to get a fair sampling. And I'll have to say that Dr. Miller has been just about the best, so he has really had a tremendous array of data and information. I would just urge you to do what he has indicated also, and that is to continue to look at both models, whatever sets of data you may encounter in the classroom, continue to test everything by the two models. Get the literature in creation as well as evolution and study it out for yourself. I believe that all the questions he has raised have good answers if we had the time to develop them. He probably would say the same thing about mine. At any rate, it's still a question that's unsettled and deserves full exposure and consideration, no longer the indoctrination in one system only, which has been the experience of the past. I appreciate your coming tonight. I appreciate Dr. Miller, Dr. Rohr, all those that have had a part in this. It's been good to visit with you for this brief period. Thank you very much.